welcome everyone to today's hot topic briefing by the Emerging Payments Association Asia. I'm Camilla Bullock, and today we're going to focus on ESG, environmental, social, and governance, and it refers to those criteria that investors use to evaluate companies' sustainability and ethical practice. When we at the Emerging Payments Associations, we are all about policy and advocacy to improve the payments industry. And in our conversations we have across the region and globally, we sort of take the temperature of what are people asking about, what do they have for interest, what's happening this month. And that is how we're shaping those hot topic briefings. We also use them to broadcast new information coming out. So you might have seen on Thursday, we're going to look at the learnings from for the first phase of the Nexus. So then we're shifting over to real-time payments. But today it's all about ESG. And I should say also on this topic that it's really, out of all topics we talk about, it's one of those where we want all boats to rise with the tide. So it's really where we have to share best practice and encourage each other to live up to the best standards and to improve. We have also included ESG as one of the categories in the Excellence in Payments Awards that EPA are hosting the inaugural ceremony this year. So keep a lookout for that also. But today, amazing panel. I'm going to let Monica introduce you to them. Monica Yosuya is our ambassador. She's based in Indonesia. She is from India. And she is a product and business leader. There's really a specialist in creating digital financial solutions. And she's done so across the globe, both in US, Taiwan, India, Indonesia, and Singapore. She's one of the top fintech global thought leaders and also top 50 B2B leaders in the APAC region. So we are absolutely delighted to have Monica with us here today. And Monica once said to me that she is committed to leaving the world a better place than she found it. So Monica, here you are, the stage is yours. Please inspire. Here you have your panel for today.
Thank you so much, Camilla, and thank you to Emerging Payments for allowing me this opportunity. And I'm looking forward to not only hearing from the panelists, but going from this webinar a much more learned and knowledgeable person. So thanks again. So let's get started with a quick introduction around the panel and of our amazing speakers who have joined us today. So first we have Anu Chaudhary. She is dedicated to the ESG pursuit since 2002. She is a part of several international forums and serves as an advisor to international organizations in Europe, Asia, and Africa, including the United Nations, American National Accreditation Board, and the Gold Standard Foundation in Switzerland, liaising between businesses, policymakers, governments, and regulators to propel ESG-based strategies and bridge related knowledge and capability gaps. Welcome, Anu.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you so much.
Then next, we have Leanne Bradley. She has started off her career in asset management. She's on the advisory board of Frank Green. Currently, she's the co-CEO of Suit2Go, a fintech consultancy, helping new entrants in the Australian market and currently consulting to an ESG super fund. She is also an EPA ambassador and a founding advisory board member. Welcome, Leanne.
Thanks, Monica. Welcome. Thanks for the welcome.
And last but not the least, we have Lauren. He has worked in financial services industry for around 15 years with roles in UK, Singapore, and Australia in commercial and institutional banking, retail banking, and payments. Welcome, Lauren.
Thank you. Hi, everyone.
And thanks to each one of you who has joined us. We will be having a separate section for Q&A. So please make sure that you leave your questions with us by using the chat box. And we will be monitoring this as we go through the webinar. Today, we are going to address the strategy for payment businesses and what it actually means to be an ESG compliant business. We will be going through the basics and obviously delving into deeper subjects as we go along. So why don't we start off and actually learn a little bit about the roles that each one of these our panelists have played in the ESG arena and how involved they are with how they got involved with ESG in which capacity in the first place. So maybe we can start off with Anu in terms of her current focus areas and her current line of work. Anu, over to you.
Thanks, Monica. Hi, everyone. Currently, I am heading the global ESG vertical for Unicus Consulting. This is a consulting and advisory firm providing end-to-end services in ESG climate change, enabled with technology. And we have presence in the United States, in Europe, Middle East, and India. And we have been providing services right from for organizations starting their journey in ESG, from initial strategy, roadmap, to implementing the roadmap, building targets, KPI frameworks for the companies, helping them monitor and evaluate how they are performing on their ESG parameters, and then doing annual reporting, disclosures, and helping them with improving their rating significantly across all global standards.
Thank you so much, Anu. Could we go to Leanne?
Sure. Thanks, Monica, and welcome everyone. I have been involved in ESG for a couple of decades now. About 23 years ago, I was involved in the launch of one of the first ESG investment funds in the Australian market. And back then was a member of the Ethical Investment Association, which is now known as the Responsible Investment Association of Australasia. I was also a founding board member of Frank Green, which is a sustainable water bottle and coffee cup company, which also has a QR payment chip within the product with the Internet of Things and a mobile payment app. In one of my asset management roles, I was involved in constructing portfolios for governments, charities, endowments, and these portfolios were tailored to meet ESG needs. Back then, it was seen as a separate capability because ESG was not part of the mainstream of how money was invested. But I've certainly seen a change in that in only the last 5 to 7 years, where in some of the biggest sectors in the Asian market, such as the Australian superannuation market, ESG is a huge focus. That's an area where I'm currently consulting, as well as through my role as co-CEO for Sweet2Go. We see many fintechs that aim to help with the data aggregation and reporting in the area of ESG because it is such a growing area.
Wonderful to have you, Leanne. And over to Lauren.
Yeah, thank you very much. I guess my involvement in ESG really started in earnest when I joined TPA, which was only a few months ago. And whilst I had been exposed to it in my previous roles, I had the opportunity to drive the ESG conversation here. And there is a really strong support from the organisation, from the executive and the board to really drive the organisation as it matures and align our strategy and our goals with an ESG strategy. So that's where I come in. I guess TPA, the payment app, is a very young organisation. We're only just over 3 years old. We're an incubator. Basically, we buy and we build payment and financial solutions. And for us, being a full stack in-house development house, what we want to do is to also align a strategy for payment to an ESG strategy and make sure we deliver against that. So that's where we are. We're developing, I guess, the strategy. We're aligning our goals and our values and trying to come up with a solution that makes sense. And everything we do, we always have ESG at the front of our mind. So I'm a bit of an advocate for it for the company and trying to drive that. Hello?
I think Monica might have frozen for a second there. So she will come back just away.
I'm back. I think my
there you are. You good?
I think she's
Monica, are you on? I think she might have fallen off, but here she's coming up. It's never a webinar without a little bit of technical challenges. We'll see if she comes on. One thing that I'm thinking a lot about just when I'm listening and we're diving into this conversation, so all this is just straight off my mind of having had a roundtable on this topic before. Monica, if you're back, just break in and speak.
Yes, I am.
Okay, then I'll hold my questions.
Sorry about that.
They're all yours again.
Okay, let's start off by actually asking the question that everybody has on their mind, specifically for those of us who are still learning, which is, what is the ESG strategy? Dive into this by starting off with Anu.
Sure, Monica, thanks. So, well, I've been working in this space since over 2 decades. It's 23 years now, and ESG was not a term that was used, up until say 5 years ago. So this has evolved into the way it is today. In today's world, ESG refers to a set of environmental, social, and governance considerations in an economy. So it represents the risks and opportunities which may impact an organization's ability to create long-term value, including but not limited to climate change and resource scarcity. Usually that is a misconception that everybody holds, that ESG is all about environmental issues. That is certainly not the case. ESG is something the majority of large established organizations now report on, and it is something that more investors are also prioritizing, because that in a way ensures the sustainability of the business as a whole. We are not talking about sustainable development here, but rather sustainability of the business itself. Individuals, are beginning to understand and concentrate, more on ESG matters when deciding which organizations to work with, what products to buy, or which organizations to bank with and work for. And this all means that there is a changing perception in the common man. The way of course we make payments can have a substantial positive impact on our society's environmental impact, carbon emissions specifically, the waste generation out of this, and you may say that it is a very, very minute impact if you look at it individually, but once it all comes together, it is very, very significant. So basically, ESG in payment industry empowers citizens to take control of their carbon emissions, in their everyday lives with small changes that add up. They are able to collect data that drives insights into how people spend, driving new investment into products and services that are good for the bottom line, people, and the planet as a whole. And then, allow payment organizations to be market leaders and change makers, advocating for a more people and planet focused business model and way of life. So in this way, payment services, that prioritize environmental and social factors can play an essential role in stimulating investment and shaping the future.
And makes a lot of sense. And Anu, this is very critical because each one of us has to look at our impact that we are creating, and of course the businesses for whom the bottom line is extremely important. So it's good to hear to be able to manage that bottom line along with being socially a lot more astute. So we'll go over to Leanne on this particular subject, specifically taking off from what Anu just mentioned. So as consumers, and you're looking at the investment space, how do we look at how we are spending to how consumers are now looking at both the way they are spending their money, what they are spending, and how they can manage their footprint?
Yeah, so ESG has been an area of focus for the investment industry for quite a long time, but only just coming into the mainstream and one of the fastest growing areas of investment in Australia to date. So a lot of investors in the region look at when they're investing in companies, the way in which firms are their practices when it comes to ESG. And so analysts are incorporating ESG criteria into their investment selection process, using data from external sources in order to, analyse the companies and demonstrate their ESG performance. And it's looking at their performance from an environmental, social, and corporate governance point of view. There is also a huge increase in sustainable investment funds, and these are areas of companies that are focused on improving the impact, whether it's environmentally or socially. and are somewhat aligned to the UN sustainability goals. There's also quite a lot of activism, particularly in Australia, with shareholder engagement, where investors may hold a certain company, but by holding that company, they actively engage with the company in their ESG practices in order to improve that. And I guess the other, growing area in investment is what we call transitional. So it's looking at best-in-class companies that may not be fully impact in the way in which they run their business, but are moving from old ways of doing business to more sustainable ways of doing business. And so looking at leaders in that area of transition, whether it be energy consumption or the way in which they run their businesses in terms of if they're a finance organisation, who they lend to, etc., and things like that. So that's, I guess, how the investment industry has looked at ESG for a number of years.
Thank you so much, Leanne. And Lauren, if I could ask you the same question, what are you finding as ESG applies to the payments industry in your work at TPA? Lauren, you're speaking on mute.
Of course I was, sorry. My apologies. I guess from my point of view, it's we're early on in the journey and probably a little bit behind, but a lot of the things that Leanne just talked about resonate with us. I think we've seen in the way the decision-making process is applied and the way businesses decide who to engage with, there's certainly a lot more attention paid to the strategy of those businesses they're going to partner with. It forms part of, it's not just a risk appetite question anymore, it becomes a bit broader than that. And I think the way companies will interact with each other does take into account how they perform against CSG goals. And that's why we feel it's not a hygiene factor anymore. It's becoming front of mind and needs to be something that is done. It's just good business and good corporate citizenship.
You're on
Monica,
mute.
now you're on mute.
God, what are we doing? Sorry about that. I was going to say that this is a good time to ask the next question, which is about payments in general, but also about how we actually use payments, and more importantly, payment industry players having huge access to data. So I know that Leanne and Anu have mentioned about the sustainability piece, and of course, in being able to manage our footprint. So from the payment industry perspective, since there is so much data available, there's so much access to the data, which is also now being made available to various data analytics and other companies. How can we actually use this to be able to measure from an ESG perspective, both our footprint as well as what we can do better? And are there any examples that you'd like to share with the group? Maybe Leanne, I can go to you first.
Yeah, sure. So there's a couple of examples. So yeah, as Anu mentioned, there's a huge amount of transaction data that the payment industry has at its fingertips. And this information is about the merchant, the products and services purchased. And this data can help consumers understand their environmental and social impact of their purchases to make more informed decisions. So some examples that we've seen in the region, in Alipay a couple of years ago, they introduced a feature to track the carbon footprint based on consumption habits around transportation and energy usage. And they allow within their app to offset their carbon emissions by purchasing carbon credits through the platform. There's a very similar example of an app in Australia that was recently launched called Super Obvious, and it uses an external data provider to label and categorise transactions that go through people's bank accounts that they can load onto the app. And can tell them what their carbon emissions are. And then it shows you how you can offset those impacts through investment in ESG funds and what your net impact is through both your payments and transactions versus your investment.
That's brilliant. And Lauren, Anu, would you like to share any examples as well? Please feel free to chime in.
Sure, Monica. So some of these, leading companies like MasterCard, Visa, ACI Worldwide. I mean, there are several others: Alibaba Group, Affirm, American Express, Apple. They are all making a mark in the, in the payments industry and in the ESG theme specifically. So in the past 7 years, more than $9 billion have been invested in ESG-related deals globally. And Visa and MasterCard, who are at the top in the industry, have both opted to tie executive compensation to ESG targets. Now, this is very significant. JP Morgan Chase has a sustainable development target of more than $2 trillion to facilitate and finance ESG projects over the next 10 years. So, yeah.
That is pretty huge, especially tying executive compensations with ESG goals and targets. Like, that's super critical. And it actually goes from top down. So that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for sharing this with us. This is really critical. Lauren, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, maybe a couple of things which talk to what the other panelists have already talked about. But I think, especially in the card space with the MCC data that we get access to, being payment providers, all that data is quite rich, and that gives us an opportunity to see how people are using their money and what they're using it towards, and give us an opportunity to then use that data to market products that are probably that can help them offset their carbon footprint or do something a bit different in the way they approach the payments. So the data-rich environment we operate in really creates opportunities. And then if we look on the other side of the issuer side of the market, there is a lot of work that is being done for recyclable plastic cards that are being issued. Looking at, ocean plastic is becoming quite a big thing. So issuing ocean plastic cards, which basically you remove all of that plastic from the ocean and gets repurposed for something else. So there are a lot of initiatives that are being used. And using the example of MasterCard, they announced recently, I think that in April it was, that by 2028, they will remove the use of PVC plastic from payment cards on the network, which is potentially an example of how the market is going ahead of the regulation and really driving the ESG conversation instead of waiting for it to be driven by the regulators.
That's absolutely brilliant. And actually, all these initiatives are creating a lot of awareness between not just consumers, but also businesses as to not only how they become compliant, but also consumer preferences, which are changing. So great segue into our next question, which is actually about consumer preferences. So while we know that ESG is becoming extremely relevant, why have ESG factors become more and more important in the decision-making process for both investors and consumers? Are consumer preferences of Gen Z, millennials specifically, driving this ESG agenda mainstream? So maybe we can start off with you, Lauren, and then go back to Anu and then to Leanne for this question.
Yeah, sure. As I mentioned before, I think from an investor point of view, what we've experienced and noticed is that it has become part of the decision-making process. So who we partner with has got, we will have a look at their ESG strategy and what they do in that space. And that will form part of a decision-making process. And equally, we're getting asked the same questions from our investors. From the consumer point of view, if we look at the size of the market specifically with Gen Z and millennials, they represent about 26% of the population today. If we look at a recent survey from Amundi and the Business Times, 82% of Gen Z and close to 65% of millennial investors have exposure to ESG investments. So just through that data, we can see that it is not a nice to have anymore. The investors are looking for that component. Again, just looking at the size of the prize here, in 2021 in the US, millennials invested $51.1 billion in ESG funds. That compares to $5 billion in 2015. So again, it shows that it is front of mind. It is becoming part of normal business operation. It needs to be normalized, and it's probably a good thing.
That's a staggering statistics there. Anu, would you like to chime in?
Sure. I mean, not much to add after what Lauren said on the numbers. So thanks for covering that, Lauren. I would just say that, introducing ESG in the payments industry has created a new horizon for the consumers. They have so much more accessibility to information. They have so much more visibility of their footprint, both in terms of spending as well as in terms of environmental impact that they are creating. And the social impact, because of digitization, because of, ESG in payments, is something which is not very well known currently to a general stakeholder, but is being talked about now by the investors, by customers as well, who are fairly advanced in their knowledge around this. So once we start talking about all of this, as part of one, ESG framework for a company, for a payment industry, there will be a lot more takers to this. So we are already seeing demand, but I think this is just the tip of the iceberg. Basically, there's a lot more that will happen as we move forward.
Amazing. And Leanne, from the investments point of view and what you're seeing with various examples that you had quoted, do you see that Gen Z and millennials are also driving the demand for companies to become more ESG oriented and aware?
Yeah, absolutely. There's been many studies done in the investment industry with the intergenerational wealth transfer from the baby boomer to millennials and Gen Z, and how they want to ensure that any inheritance is invested in sustainable ways. And, you can see that in the flows in the investment industry, even though the markets have been extremely volatile over the last year and also through the pandemic. The one sector that held up through that time was ESG investments. And also more subtly but extremely obvious is those that want to work for sustainable businesses. So I mentioned earlier that I'm consulting to a ESG super fund at the moment. You can see when there is a similar role to other firms versus the applicants that apply to a responsibly, B Corp rated institution versus one that's not. It's about 100 to 1. So people want to work for sustainable, responsible businesses, and they want to invest and also buy from sustainable businesses.
That is quite enlightening. And actually, it's a great segue into our next question associated, which is very similar to what we are just discussing. But how as consumers, and I know that this is one question which has come up in our Q&A as well, how do we as consumers really understand our footprint, and what are some of the learnings or case studies based on the couple of examples that you've shared, which can help us to examine and become more aware consumers of, first of all, how we are spending our money, what kind of footprint we are creating, and how can we improve ourselves, our lives, and also this ESG footprint that we have created. Leanne, maybe we can start off with you.
Sure. Well, there's various ways. So we've mentioned there are some apps out there that can tell you how you're spending your money and your carbon footprint, and then can provide investments to offset that. There's also, within the payment industry, some ESG ratings specifically available for merchants, which can help consumers identify more sustainable businesses to support. There is also reward programs that are available, which incentivize consumers to make more sustainable purchases. And so there are partnerships done between companies that allow them to make purchases that are a lot more sustainable and earn more rewards or points as a result of that. And the payments industry in general is becoming a lot more online, in-app, electronic, as opposed to paper-based. And so just the way in which you transact is becoming more and more sustainable.
Brilliant. Anu?
Sure, Monica. So I'll break it down into E, S, and G, how all of this culminates into very specific criteria under this. So when it comes to E, it indicates how an organization interacts with and impacts the physical environment and ecosystems. So the environmental aspect of ESG is a critical factor in the banking and payment space. So, this has been incorporated in many ways in the industry operations. Payment firms and banks have introduced various initiatives, including application programming interfaces, APIs, to launch green products. So banks and technology vendors are repurposing the overall banking service capabilities to optimize their financial wellness goals and ESG impact. Retail divisions in various multinational banks have introduced additional APIs to collaborate with external partners who have committed to designing new green products and increasing customer awareness about the environmental impact of transactions. Then the second way of doing this is carbon offsets, rewards, and loyalty programs. So many financial institutions have started offering loyalty and reward points for customer transactions in the form of carbon offset programs. Another way of doing this is adopting eco-friendly material for payment products. So financial institutions are increasingly switching to green energy providers and vendors for low energy lights in offices, ATMs, etc., as Leanne mentioned as well. Then use of sustainable fintech products and technologies, use of blockchain, machine learning, artificial intelligence, big data, and Internet of Things to capture data and integrate sustainability into existing products. When it comes to the social aspect, which is represented, in the form of an organization's relationships and reputation among individuals and institutions in the communities in which it conducts business. So over the past 2 decades, the scope of the social aspect of ESG has progressively expanded, reflecting the changing business environment of the 21st century, where markets and businesses are becoming more integrated and interdependent. The payment sector is, addressing the social aspect through various actions for stakeholders. Some of these include initiatives like, initiatives for financial inclusion, various, projects being implemented for the financial inclusion of the socially marginalized sections of society. For example, like financial literacy initiatives that many companies are doing. Then people development initiatives. Companies have been putting more effort into bringing about change within their organizations by assisting their staff, providing best-in-class training, creating employee engagement programs. Another way of doing this is, encouraging ESG adoption among vendors and suppliers. So, we are observing this a lot, in fact, over the last 2 years, where organizations now are encouraging their value chain to adopt ESG. And they have set certain very stringent criteria as well, around ESG parameters to evaluate their vendor sourcing via the request for proposals. Then coming to governance, this comprises the internal system of rules, controls, and processes adopted by businesses to govern themselves, make effective legal decisions, and fulfill the needs of external stakeholders. So some of the initiatives include, robust governance systems, formulating policies to allocating rights and duties among various stakeholders and organizations. Then increased transparency, focus is to aid the development of climate of trust, accountability, and transparency required for, promoting long-term investment, financial stability, and enabling societies with better growth. And there are several case studies out there, since the last year that we've seen. Then, as I mentioned earlier, linking executive compensation to ESG goals. And this is again being increasingly adopted as a new criteria in the CEO variable pay and several other ways as well. Yeah.
That's a really long list, and it's so amazing to hear about all these examples. I think really sets the ball rolling for all of us to be able to recognize these examples, become more aware, of course. Lauren, would you like to add some as well?
I don't think there is much to add to a very comprehensive answer from Anu. I guess the only thing I'd say is, from a consumer point of view, there is a lot of choice out there, and I think payment providers in particular are really driving the opportunity for options. We talked about different types of cards, whether they're recycled plastics or bamboo or materials that are non-polluting. That's one option, but also there's been a lot of work done in not so recent time, I guess, but around card present, using mobile pays, using wearables and things like that. I think the payment industry is keeping up and trying to give options to the consumers, and the consumers have the final choice and the ability to make choices that align with their own values and their own needs and wants in terms of how they want to participate in that conversation.
Perfect. So just want to briefly touch on this subject, because I know you've mentioned a couple of names earlier, like Visa, MasterCard, Affirm, and a host of others who are doing well on the ESG front. So typically, how do these companies benchmark themselves? Are there various standards and best practices that are available in the industry that industry counterparts should look to?
So yes, Monica, there are various standards. In fact, I'm not sure if that's so much of a good thing, because it's also very confusing for organizations to decide what is it that they should be going for. So what is, I think we are at a stage where very soon we will have one integrated standard, at least industry-wise, for stakeholders to know what is relevant for them. You cannot have a one-size-fits-all sort of standard in ESG. So this is being worked on right now. But currently, what most organizations are doing is they are benchmarking themselves with industry best practices, what the global trends are. And the third thing is, of course, their national targets. So what their governments have committed to, because after all, it cascades down to the private sector and corporates to implement that, right, on ground. So if I were to give you an example of MasterCard, they are specializing in payment technology with over 20,000 banks and issuers around the world. And, the ability to reach out to billions of people worldwide. And they are in a prime position to mobilize its partners and customers to act on climate change together. So they have been taking up several measures, so they are the ones to look up to. I would say in the payments industry, they've done, several exemplary initiatives over the last few years, and they continue to lead. I'm not sure how we are doing on time, but I would love to share some examples maybe later on, of what MasterCard is doing.
Actually, there is a question that Arindam has asked, so maybe we could address that question right now, which is about what are some of the good examples of companies that we can look at in the payment space as an example. So maybe we can share that right now.
Sure. Okay. So as I was talking about MasterCard, they have undertaken several ESG interventions, and some of them include CO2 innovation. So to help consumers understand more about their spending and its potential environmental impact, MasterCard has developed a carbon calculator in collaboration with a Swedish fintech company. It uses different categories such as food and drink and transport to show people in the carbon footprint of each transaction. The estimates are based on an index which measures carbon impacts. Then the calculator has already been adopted by several of MasterCard's banking partners, from traditional financial institutions to emerging fintechs, who are also integrating it into their own consumer-facing apps. Also monitoring the carbon footprint of their spending, the app can, apart from that, the app can also be designed to suggest ways consumers can counteract their carbon impacts. So that's very, very interesting. It's think of it as a game, using comparisons such as number of trees required to absorb the same amount of CO2 that you have emitted because of your activities. Users could then make donations toward, tree planting projects or other such initiatives, using their card's loyalty points towards this. Then apart from using innovative tech, they also focus on collaboration. So MasterCard is working to create new models of collaboration with its global network of partners. So, for example, the Priceless Planet Coalition, which MasterCard launched and is running with Conservation International and WRI, World Resources Institute. It brings together over 80 businesses worldwide to set about restoring 100 million trees, also supporting the World Economic Forum's 1 trillion trees platform. So yeah, several such examples I could share.
That's an amazing list. Leanne, would you like to add to this as well, based on some examples that you've seen?
Yeah, well, in the payment space, there's several Australian companies that have committed to carbon neutral impacts in the next decade. And they're looking at a range of initiatives in order to achieve that, such as using renewable energy within their business, the way in which they package their products to their end users, the ability to make a donation to many charitable causes, whether it is to offset their payments or just to increase their customers' impact. There's also so Afterpay and Up, digital banker examples of companies doing things like that. There's also companies that specialise in point of sale solutions to offset their carbon emissions, which I think Anu alluded to. Companies like Tapa are involved in things like that. And there is, just companies that are integrating payments and sustainability, such as Frank Green, that I'm involved in, which is a renewable coffee cup and water bottle company that has a way of doing QR payments to reduce the amount of plastic water bottles and plastic single-use waste around the world, as well as frictionless payment aspects that enable you to build loyalty credits that then end up either being able to be used by other people, coffee, like the underprivileged, or give to a charity of choice.
That's brilliant. So I have a question though on the technology front. So maybe I can ask Lauren this question. So while we are discussing a lot about ESG and how we focus on this compared to even like 2 or 5 years back, if you take a step back, the question is, when we have to balance now as business leaders in given the current economic crisis that many countries are facing, if you have to look at a commercial opportunity and you have to look at the payments infrastructure as a payments infrastructure company and somebody who is helping both pay out as well as get paid. Suppose there is a provider who sells tobacco or some such good, which is not really good from the social perspective or the S part of ESG. What would be those social considerations that you would take into, and how does that kind of strategy and governance, which businesses need to adhere to, would help dictate what they would do in such a scenario?
Yes, thank you. I guess that's it's a commercial decision that needs to have a balanced view and approach to answering if there was a major opportunity to provide payment servicing or acquiring services to a particular merchant that stocks and sells tobacco. I guess there would be a question around, is that the only product, or are they a broader marketplace that happens to sell that sort of product? How does that align with our strategy, and is that something we are willing or not willing to participate in? I think it becomes part of that conversation, and that's where having a strong governance in place and being very transparent with our board and with our investor comes into play. Would you walk away from such a great opportunity? Maybe, maybe not. It's, each individual opportunity would have to be assessed independently. The other side of the coin, I guess, is that sometimes there may be some companies, and ExxonMobil might come to mind, that you look at and you think, we don't want to do business with them. Clearly, they've got a bad name. They're in oil and gas, terrible industry. But really, when you start digging a little bit further and looking at what their ESG strategy is and what they are doing to offset the carbon footprint or to really be a good world citizen, they're actually not that bad. They're ranked number 44, I think, in ESG, if I'm not mistaken, in 2022. So then that begs the question, well, if they're doing so much to better themselves and try and improve, is that not someone we want to support as opposed to someone else that is not doing as much? So the conversation is quite broad, and I think having really strong guiding principles and a really strong strategy and transparency around our process and the decision-making process is paramount to making these decisions, and not necessarily just it feels good or it feels bad.
And that's so important for us to hear, because we have to balance the commercial trade-offs and decisions against what this would mean. And of course, there shouldn't be a trade-off at some point, but we have to do what we have to do for business. Now, in the interest of time, since we have about 15 minutes left and there are a couple of questions that have also come up, I'm actually going to go into the regulation side of the business, because in payments, regulations and payments go together hand in hand. So would like to jump to Anu and ask her about the regulations and how they are evolving worldwide, and obviously what kind of impact would we see that we need to foresee in the upcoming year, specifically as it relates to ESG.
So Monica, what we are observing over the last couple of years, and so the regulations that have been implemented and the ones which are in the pipeline are mostly around reporting and disclosures. So and the moment, I mean, that's a good way of triggering the whole process, because when you are asked to report something on a public domain, you would obviously have to have a good system, a good framework in place in order to be able to report something progressive. So for example, in India, we have the BRSR guidelines. So SEBI has introduced this, top 1,000 listed companies are required to publish their business responsibility and sustainability report. And this is a very, very comprehensive document. It, there you need to talk about your, all your risks and opportunities that you've identified around ESG. What is the resilience framework around that? What are your material issues? What are your ESG targets and goals? How you would be monitoring those, impact assessment, and also, very specific disclosures around, say, greenhouse gas accounting, water footprint, waste management. So all of this is being asked for. Similarly, in the Middle East, there are regulations around sustainability reporting. There are specific requirements, specific data that is being asked for. In the United States, SEC is talking about, disclosures around carbon footprint, greenhouse gas accounting, scope 3 emissions. Scope 3 basically is your value chain emissions. So what are the targets being set around that? In Europe, there is a task force on climate-related financial disclosures. So this is a very sophisticated standard, the only one which basically aligns non-financial disclosures with financial impact for a business. So you can clearly see how ESG would impact your business. Would you even be in business 5 years, 10 years down the line because of the climate risks that that you're facing if you are not prepared well enough? So as you can see, very similar ask, across the geographies. But everybody's moving towards more transparency, target setting, having quantifiable, measurable targets for themselves. Yeah.
That's amazing. See, actually having to report and be compliant actually means that there are going to be both conflicts, opportunities, and challenges. So would love to maybe take this question to Leanne and to Lauren, if they are seeing challenges emerge, obviously, because there are reporting requirements, but also, do you see any opportunities for new businesses, for others to operate in this space and actually leverage these regulations that are coming into force?
Yeah, so I think the challenge is in the reporting, and I guess choosing which standards, if you're not in a country that dictates any particular standard, which standard that you align yourself with, and having access to all the data that you need to look through in your business in order to report on your ESG practices and the impact, particularly impact measurement, I think is one of the biggest challenges. So ESG practices, I think, is becoming a lot easier to report on. And there's certainly a lot of guiding principles, both in the EU, the UK specifically, the US, and there's some global accounting standards as well that exist in terms of how to report. The challenge is reporting and measuring the impact of running of your business. And I think that's where the challenge lies. And there's certainly a lot of companies emerging in that space on how to measure impact, but all of their methodologies are different. And so one company's way of measuring impact could be very different to another's. And so it depends on, I guess, consumers and investors need to look at that data and compare that data across different participants in the same industry, and maybe look at what sources they're using in order to do that impact reporting, because everyone's methodology is quite different. So it's not necessarily apples with apples at the moment, because there's not standards in each country as to how you measure that impact. And therefore, you just need to understand, when you're looking at companies reporting, what sources they're using in order to do that.
Brilliant. Lauren, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, I mean, I guess from my point of view, we're probably a little bit early on in the journey to really have a view of what we're doing is trying to follow what is happening around the world and have a look at the regulatory landscape, particularly in Southeast Asia and in the US, and paying attention to what is happening and trying to pull out the trends so we can work out what our reporting needs to look like. We have ambitions to, look at B Corp certification down the line and things like that. We are a long way from it. We understand that it's a journey. We understand that we need to plan for it. But at the moment, we're a little bit further ahead. But certainly the complexity around the reporting and having the ability to generate data that supports or validates the benefit of the actions we're taking is important. And working out how to do it effectively is the key challenge.
Absolutely. So let me actually ask this question, taking off from this, what you just mentioned. So Anu, if I can address this question to you, what is the best and easiest way to get started? Because we've heard of a lot of challenges. Obviously, regulations are coming in. So a lot of our listeners would like to know how and where do they get started?
Right. So that is a very intimidating question for most businesses, especially if they're just starting out in a region where ESG perhaps also is in a very nascent stage. So the general perception is that it is very time-consuming, costly proposition that to begin this. Also, the biggest misconception, I guess, is that it is not aligned with your business, with your core business. And the moment you start aligning it with your business challenges, that is where you will see real value, and you will also know what to do. So what we do generally when we are starting out, our clients on this, we have to first do a baselining study to understand what is relevant for a certain company being in a certain industry sector and geography. What is it that they should be aiming for? So, for example, if someone in automotive industry is aiming for net zero by 2030 or 2040 rather, could mining industry client or company be looking for the same thing? No, that is not relevant for them, and that is also not possible for them. So you have to set targets which are achievable yet ambitious enough, and for that you need to know where you are today. So to do a very thorough greenhouse gas accounting, carbon is at the core. So when you talk about environmental aspects, carbon is at the core for most of these factors, these parameters. And once you start looking at that, you would start looking at your incoming, the resources that you're consuming, as well as your outgoing, which is your waste generation, any kind of consumptions that you're doing in terms of travel, fuel, transportation, all of that. So this is what we do. So this ESG framework that I was talking about earlier is very, very critical, for a company to get started on the right foot. And then once this is clear, then you need not set targets where you have to do everything overnight. It is a continuous process. So that's something, you need to understand. You need to have short, mid, long-term sort of targets for yourself. Go for the lowest hanging fruits first, so that, as a company, as a management, you also start seeing results from these initiatives. So I could go on and on about this, but conscious of time, so I'll hand over back to you.
Thank you so much, Anu. And actually, you busted a couple of the misconceptions, and I was going to address, but maybe I can actually take that question up with Leanne and with Lauren, which is about the misconceptions about ESG. So Anu mentioned that, of course, one of them is that it's very expensive. Second, it's not really directly related to your business. So being in ESG right now, what are some of the misconceptions you find from both businesses as well as consumers about this space? Leanne?
I think from the, I guess, taking the investment lens, there's always been I guess, not a misconception, but a thought that are you forsaking returns or profitability by focusing on ESG and bettering your ESG practices? And I think that in the last 5 years, that conception that you have to forsake returns or profitability to be a more sustainable company is becoming a misconception. In fact, to be a better business, you need to consider ESG factors because your customers are constantly questioning your practices. And if your customers don't like your ESG practices, then you'll have less customers. And by having less customers, you'll be less profitable in the longer term. And if you're in a business that's not sustainable, then you will not have necessarily as many customers you have today or investors that you have today. And the other thing about ESG is it's actually a risk management tool for reputational risk and your future as a business. And so while it might be seen as a short-term expense, it's certainly a smart business practice for managing your long-term risk as a business. So I think the misconceptions of some of the short-term pain for a long-term gain to be relevant in the industry that you're in are some of the misconceptions that are certainly being challenged in the last 5 years.
Brilliant. Last words from you, Lauren, on this subject.
Yeah, I think I'll echo a lot of what has already been said, but for us, there were 3 key areas, I guess, that came into consideration that maybe made us pause for a second before we got started. But the first challenge was the breadth of what ESG is and what it stands for, just being able to, I guess, pick out the elements out of it, of that really broad topic that we think we can address, and we can address either in a short, medium, or long term, and identifying what they are and putting strategies in place to address them was the first really starting point. Getting, obviously, buy-in and support from our executives and board was paramount. And now that we've got that, it feels a little less daunting. We have identified the areas we want to play in. We're building that strategy around it, and it makes it a little bit easier to manage. The second element of it was around the cost. There is a perception that it has to be extremely expensive. I feel like a lot of the things that can be done, especially in the short and medium term, don't have to be expensive, and they can add value quite quickly. And there are things I would argue that most companies are already doing and don't realize that it would align with an ESG strategy. I mean, simple things like recycling, purpose-driven printing, having lights that turn off when people are out, on timers and things like that. These are not necessarily an issue that costs a lot of money. They might actually just be enabled by the business you work in, but they work and they form part of it. And finally, the realization for us that this isn't a project. It's ongoing. It has to be front of mind. It is the way we conduct business. It's the new normal. And that was probably the key element for us. It's that realization that it has to form part of everything we do now.
That is such a brilliant end to this conversation before we head into the Q&A. But I think we have addressed most of the audience questions, including from Katrina, where she asked about some of the challenges and opportunities in the space. But I know Camilla had a question that she was trying to address earlier.
I think we've run out of time, though, so I will pick the other's brain. I was going in and might actually take it a bit in another direction, just mapping this up with cyber a bit, and that sustainability, or what do you do and how do you educate your business partners and consumers on that. But we can save that for another time. I don't think this topic is going to go away. Just have to add there, and wonder if the audience has felt the same way. You've gone through this ride on this webinar, like you're feeling very optimistic, everybody's doing everything, we're doing this together. And then I go like, oh, but what are we doing? Oh no, we're doing this and this and this. But then it's like that looming of travel. That's one that I always feel like a cloud over my head, that with the traveling is such a big carbon footprint and it's really hard to go away from. But it's good that we meet like this. I think virtual still has a big role to play in how we deliver our content and how we're connecting with our audience. So I'm not going to go on talking, but I feel very energized from the conversation. So thank you, Monica, for rockstar moderation. Leanne, thank you very much. Anu and Laurent for the sharing. And thank you, audience, and for you of those who are looking at the recording. We hope to see you soon again. Thank you very much.